Once upon a time, before history was even called history, the earth was ruled by gods, not from lofty thrones in heaven, nor through invisible commandments whispered to mortals, but through flesh and power here on earth as kings. And according to an ancient text known as the Sumerian king list, these rulers governed humanity for over 241,000 years. It sounds unbelievable. How could anyone, even a myth, claim dominion over the world for so long? Who were these beings, gods, men, or something else entirely? And what kind of world existed under their reign? We're about to find out. Welcome. The year was 1902. Deep within the ruins of the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nippur, a team of archaeologists unearthed a collection of clay fragments buried for millennia. Led by the German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht, the team believed they were handling another set of mundane Sumerian tablets, inventories, hymns, trade records, or temple receipts. But as they brushed off the dust, they realized this find was different. Etched in precise cuneiform lines on the prism's surface was a list, not of gods or myths, but of rulers. It spoke in the tone of a chronicle, not a legend. Each name was followed by the length of its reign, meticulously recorded as though meant for official archives. This small artifact, known today as the Weld-Blundell prism, would soon shatter everything we thought we knew about early civilization. The prism itself is unimpressive in size, just 8 inches tall. Yet its inscriptions span thousands upon thousands of years of recorded kingship. Scholars were stunned to discover that the earliest rulers on this list were said to have reigned not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years each. According to this text, the first 8 kings of Sumer ruled a combined total of 241,200 years. 28,000 years for one, 36,000 for another, 43,000 for the next. Each number carved into clay with mathematical precision. It was too exact to dismiss as fantasy, too formal to label as myth. At first, the academic world laughed it off. Surely the Sumerians exaggerated their own past, they said. Ancient people loved grandeur, myth, and cosmic metaphors. But then something strange happened. The king list didn't end with the impossible. After those first 8 kings, the document continued, and the following names, unlike the first, matched actual archaeological findings. Kings like Gilgamesh of Urg, whose existence was later confirmed through excavations, appeared right there in the same document, as if history and legend flowed seamlessly from one line to the next. That changed everything. Because if the later kings were real, how could we dismiss the first one so easily? The text didn't distinguish between them. It didn't say mythical or divine. It simply recorded reigns in perfect, bureaucratic fashion, as though every one of these rulers truly sat upon the throne. That's when scholars realized something profound. The Sumerian king list wasn't a mythic poem. It was a chronological record. And that meant that somewhere in humanity's earliest memory, someone or something ruled for far longer than any mortal could. But who were these kings? And what kind of beings lived before the dawn of man as we know it? The Sumerians had a word for them. They called them the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. When kingship descended from heaven before pyramids, before wheels, before ink ever touched parchment, there was Eridu, a city so ancient that even the Sumerians, who built it, called it the first city ever made. They said it was not built by human hands. It was founded by order of the gods. The Sumerian king list begins its account not with war or conquest, but with a single, breathtaking line. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. That phrase alone changed everything. It didn't say kingship was invented, or earned, or discovered. It descended. Something or someone brought it down from above. According to the ancient tablets, Eridu was the cradle of civilization, a sacred city where gods and men once coexisted, where temples gleamed like stars under the desert sun, and where the first ruler of earth was crowned, a being named Alulim. Who was Alulim? Not a conqueror, not a warrior, not even a mere mortal. To the Sumerians, Alulim was the first king of earth, appointed by divine decree. He was not born into power. He was chosen. In the early hymns, Alulim is described as a shepherd of men, endowed with celestial wisdom and possessing knowledge beyond human comprehension. His rule marked the moment humanity entered a new era when order replaced chaos and civilization as we know it began. But here's the enigma. According to the king list, Alulim's reign lasted 28,800 years. Let that sink in. Not 28, not 200, not 2,000. 28,800 years. That's nearly 300 lifetimes of a modern human being. Historians have spent decades trying to rationalize these numbers. Were they symbolic? Were the Sumerians counting in divine cycles? Or could they perhaps have been telling a truth that we no longer understand? You see, the Sumerians didn't record random figures. They used a base 60 mathematical system, a structure that influenced our own measurement of time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. To them, numbers weren't arbitrary. They were sacred, cosmic. The unit they used was called a sar, equal to 3,600 years. And Alulim's reign, 8 sars long, fit perfectly into the Sumerian system of divine chronology. This wasn't hyperbole. It was precision. In their worldview, each sar represented not just years, but an entire cosmic cycle, a rotation of divine order. Alulim's 8 sars symbolized a full spectrum of celestial perfection. And yet, to the Sumerians, it wasn't metaphor. It was history. Modern scholars try to interpret this through logic. They suggest perhaps each year was actually a lunar month, or a mistranslation, or a numerical exaggeration. But no matter how they recalculate, the pattern remains deliberate. 28,800 years, 8 cycles, always 8. The number of creation, infinity, renewal. So what if the Sumerians weren't exaggerating? What if they were describing beings who didn't age the way humans do? According to later texts, Alulim wasn't alone in his rule. He governed under the watch of the Anunnaki, the gods of the sky and the earth. They were described as radiant, tall, and incomprehensibly wise. They were the architects of civilization, the givers of writing, mathematics, and kingship itself. Many researchers, from ancient historians to modern theorists like Zecharia Sitchin, have argued that the Anunnaki were not mythical gods, but visitors, beings who came to Earth from the stars and whose reign over humanity was later recorded in mythic language. If that's true, then Alulim's 28,800-year reign may not be metaphorical at all, but the record of a non-human timeline, Archaeologically, Eridu exists. It lies in southern Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, and its remains date back to at least 5400 BCE. Excavations revealed multiple temple foundations, each built upon the ruins of an earlier one, layer upon layer, as if civilizations kept rebuilding over the same divine ground. At the heart of Eridu stood the Abzu, a temple dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and creation. This is where kingship began, and where Ululim was said to have received his authority from the heavens. The Sumerians believed that before Ululim, humanity lived like animals, without law, without leadership. It was only after kingship descended that civilization took shape. Writing, agriculture, governance, all began under divine instruction. So the question is, was Ululim simply a mythic archetype of leadership? Or was he part of an ancient event, a time when gods truly walked among men? Because if the king list is to be believed, Ululim wasn't just the first king of Eridu. He was the first king of Earth. King Alaugr and the Age of Divine Order, after Ululim's 28,800-year reign, came to an end. The heavens did not withdraw their favor. Instead, the king list says something remarkable. Then kingship was in Eridu, and Alaugr became king. He ruled for 36,000 years. 36,000 years. That's 10 full SARs, 10 sacred cycles of divine chronology. To the Sumerians, this number wasn't random. It was perfection squared. If Ululim represented the dawn of kingship, Alaugr embodied its permanence. Where Ululim had established rule, Alaugr refined it. He was said to be the architect of the world's first governance system, one that united both divine will and human obedience. Under his rule, Eridu was not merely a city. It was a celestial kingdom. Ancient tablets portray Alaugr as a radiant figure, a being whose wisdom surpassed that of men. His reign was characterized by prosperity, harmony, and expansion. He was not remembered for conquest or conflict, but for turning divine law into earthly structure. He didn't rule over people. He ruled through order. But here's where it gets fascinating. Archaeologists who excavated Eridu found temple foundations dating back to 5400 BCE, long before the pyramids, long before Egypt, long before recorded history anywhere else on Earth. And at the lowest layers, the oldest ones, they found something astonishing, a temple design that was already advanced. No primitive stages, no trial and error. It appeared perfect from the beginning. Who taught these ancient builders how to align structures with celestial precision? The sun, the moon, the stars, thousands of years before we believe such knowledge existed? The Sumerians themselves answered that question. The gods did. According to Sumerian myth, Eridu was the dwelling of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation. He was said to have descended from the heavens and lived among men in Eridu, in a great temple that shimmered like the sea. Many scholars believe Alaugr served directly under Enki, a chosen ruler who governed humanity on behalf of divine beings. In some texts, Alaugr is even described as the steward of Enki, tasked with maintaining balance between heaven and earth. He was the first intermediary king, a link between gods and mortals. So what did his reign look like? Imagine an age of enlightenment when knowledge flowed freely from the divine realm. Astronomy, agriculture, city planning, all perfected under Alaugr. Eridu grew from a single settlement into a vast sacred metropolis. Temples aligned with constellations. Canals reflected the movement of the stars. Every brick, every pillar, every street followed cosmic geometry. This wasn't a kingdom built by trial and error. It was engineered. Now here's where the mystery deepens. Some modern researchers, including ancient astronaut theorists, believe Eridu was more than a spiritual city. They claim it was a functional outpost, a command center established by the Anunnaki. According to this theory, Alaugr was not a human king at all. He was a direct emissary of these celestial beings, an administrator or even a hybrid being, entrusted to oversee the development of human civilization. Evidence? The sudden leap in architecture, agriculture, and governance that emerged in Sumer with no known predecessors. The precision of Sumerian mathematics and astronomy, and the recurring theme in their texts. Knowledge always descended, never evolved. If that sounds familiar, it's because nearly every ancient culture shares this same motif. In Egypt, the gods descended to teach men order. In Mesoamerica, the gods of the sky gifted knowledge and fire. In the Vedic texts, celestial beings bestowed divine science upon kings. It's the same story told in different languages. Always the same pattern. Divine descent, rule, and withdrawal. Alaugr's reign for 36,000 years fits that pattern perfectly. Each Sar, each 3,600-year cycle, represented a phase of divine-human collaboration. 10 full cycles symbolized completion, the fullness of divine governance on earth. If Alulim was the first to receive kingship, then Alaugr perfected it. He institutionalized the divine order, establishing rituals, temples, and priest kings that would outlast millennia. When Eridu eventually declined, its legacy spread throughout Sumer. Cities like Ur-Uruk and Bad Tibira carried forward its sacred template. The concept that kingship was not a human invention, but a heavenly mandate. But with great order often comes great mystery. Some researchers propose that Alaugr's reign may have ended not through death, but through departure. Texts describe the return of the kingship to the heavens. Did Alaugr simply die, or did he, like the gods who appointed him, ascend? If so, that might explain the strange continuity between the kings. The next ruler, Enmenluana, didn't rise from chaos. He took the throne seamlessly, as if kingship itself was transferred, like a torch passed between immortal hands. So the story continued, from Elulim to Alaugr to the next line of celestial kings. Each reign longer, stranger, more deliberate than the last. And with Enmenluana, the mystery only deepened because his city, Bad Tibira, would become known as the Forge of the Gods. Enmenluana, the king of the Forge, after the 36,000-year reign of Alaugr came to a close. The Sumerian king list records a new name, a ruler who reigned longer than either of his predecessors. Then Enmenluana became king. He ruled for 43,200 years. 43,200 years. That's 12 full Sars, 12 divine cycles. Each Sar, as the ancient text describe, was not just a number. It was a heartbeat of cosmic order. To rule for 12 of them meant something profound. Enmenluana's reign represented completion, the full zodiacal circle, a return to divine symmetry. His city was Bad Tibira, the city of the metal smiths. To the ancient Sumerians, it was not merely a city, it was a workshop of the gods. Here, divine knowledge was not only worshipped, it was forged. Bad Tibira appears in both the king list and other Sumerian myths, and its name means wall of the metalworkers. According to legend, this was where the Anunnaki, the great celestial beings, created and maintained the technologies of civilization. Some accounts describe it as the place where the divine blueprints of order, were stored, a cosmic archive containing all the laws, sciences, and arts that structured the universe. So when Enmenluwana ascended the throne, he inherited not just kingship, but guardianship over these divine tools. Archaeologically, the region associated with Bad Tibira reveals signs of early metallurgy, copper working, smelting, and furnace technology thousands of years earlier than historians once believed possible. It's as if humanity had suddenly leapt forward from clay and stone to metal and fire. No slow evolution, just eruption. The Book of Enoch spoke of Azazel teaching men metallurgy, revealing forbidden knowledge of forging weapons. And now, across the world in ancient Sumer, we see a civilization whose identity was defined by metal. Coincidence or connection? Enmenluana's reign marks a time when myth and material technology fused. He wasn't just a king, he was a custodian of divine craft. The Anunnaki were said to have descended often to Bad Tibira, overseeing human progress. The texts call them the Shining Ones. They were beings of immense stature, their presence described as radiant and terrifying. They came, it was said, to refine the earth's abundance and humanity itself. In the mythology, Enmenluana worked directly under the god Enlil, the lord of wind, command, and kingship. If Enki of Eridu represented knowledge and creation, Enlil represented authority and order. Together, these two divine currents shaped the world, and Enmenluana was the bridge between them. During his reign, Bad Tibira became a model of divine engineering. Its temples, or ziggurats, were said to mirror constellations. The Sumerians described their cities as images of heaven on earth. Each structure was a map, each stone aligned with celestial precision. But it wasn't just architecture that advanced. Sumerian tradition holds that this was the era when humans were first taught to work the land systematically. Irrigation, animal domestication, metallurgy, and trade. Civilization itself was being manufactured. Yet, the more humanity learned, the more dependent it became on divine oversight. The line between gods and kings blurred. Some later texts even refer to these early kings not as men, but as divine shepherds. Their role was not to rule by force, but to maintain balance between heaven, earth, and the underworld. And yet, something began to change. The myths suggest that as human cities multiplied, their ambition grew. They wanted to create, to build, to ascend, just like their divine teachers. Perhaps it was here, in the forges of Bad Tibira, that the first seeds of rebellion were sown, the idea that humanity could be like the gods. The legends tell of a growing restlessness among mortals and gods alike. Some Anunnaki grew weary of their labor on earth, complaining to Enlil that their work was too great. It was then that a new creation was proposed, a hybrid species that would serve the gods. The Adamu, the first humans designed not as kings, but as workers. Could it be that Enmenluana's reign, with its focus on metal, labor, and divine craftsmanship, was the setting for this transformation? Was he the first ruler over both men and hybrids, a king of gods and mortals alike? It's here the king list grows quiet, but Sumerian mythology fills in the blanks. It speaks of tension between the Enlilite gods and the Enkites, between authority and freedom, between control and knowledge. Bad Kibira became the crossroads of both, a place where divine secrets were shared and possibly abused. And Menluana's 43,200-year reign ended, not in catastrophe, but in transition. When his rule concluded, the king list tells us kingship did not end, it shifted. Then Enmengalana became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Another city, another king, another link in the chain of impossible reigns stretching across hundreds of thousands of years. But before we move forward, consider this. Each king reigned longer than entire human civilizations have existed. Each was said to rule with divine approval, each over a world still half heaven, half earth. These were not mythic numbers thrown at random. They represented cosmic rhythms, measured in the pulse of the gods. The next ruler, Enmengalana, would preside over the slow waning of divine contact, an age when the line between heaven and earth began to fade, and the gods started to withdraw. Enmengalana, the fading of the divine light, then Enmengalana became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. By now, even the Sumerians were hinting that time itself had changed. The numbers were still vast, but shorter than before, as if the divine realm were slowly closing the distance between eternity and mortality. And Enmengalana ruled from Bad Tibira, the same sacred city as Enmenluana. But his era was not one of expansion, it was one of preservation. Where his predecessors had received knowledge from the gods like fire, his reign was marked by the careful guarding of that flame. He was known as the Keeper of the Tablets. Ancient fragments suggest that under Enmengalana, the divine me, those sacred laws, blueprints, and decrees were catalogued, sealed, and stored in great sanctuaries. Knowledge, once shared openly between gods and men, was now restricted. To understand this shift, we have to remember what Sumerian culture believed, that kingship was not a human institution, it descended from heaven. It was a mantle of divine essence, passed down through chosen lineages. Each king was, in a sense, a fragment of celestial authority. But during Enmengalana's 28,800-year rule, something began to change in that relationship. Texts describe the gods as rising to the heavens, visiting earth less frequently, and speaking to mankind only through intermediaries, through dreams, omens, and rituals. It was as if the connection between heaven and earth was slowly fading. The golden age was dimming, and the light of direct divine rule was giving way to a more distant, mediated relationship. But before the gods fully withdrew, they left a legacy, one that would shape human history for millennia to come. During this period, the king list and Sumerian texts speak of the formalization of priesthoods and temple orders. Human kings were no longer just rulers, They became priests of the gods, custodians of rituals that maintained the cosmic order. The king's role was no longer about creating. It was about remembering, preserving the divine balance before it was lost forever. Archaeologically, this period aligns with what we now recognize as the late Ubaid period, the dawn of organized religion, when temples began to dominate city centers. Statues of worshippers with wide, staring eyes appear for the first time, hands clasped in perpetual devotion. Perhaps they reflect the same feeling captured in the myths, a people looking upward, longing for the gods who had once walked among them. And yet, the king list insists that kingship continued unbroken. Even as divine presence faded, its authority remained. The king still claimed descent from the gods, and their right to rule was still considered heavenly. This continuity is crucial because it implies that even after the gods withdrew, their influence endured through their chosen bloodlines. Some Sumerian scholars and esoteric researchers believe this marks the beginning of the semi-divine kings, rulers who were no longer immortal, but whose ancestry still carried divine essence. Their lifespans were shrinking, their power dimming, yet the memory of godhood lingered in their veins, and in Mangilana may have been the last to fully hold that divine spark. The myths tell us that during his reign, great upheavals took place, not wars but cosmic realignments, floods, droughts, and shifts in the stars themselves. The heavens were changing position as though signaling the end of an age. In many ancient traditions, such transitions were not random events. They marked the passing of eras, epochs ruled by different divine houses. If Enmenluana represented the height of divine-human cooperation, then Enmangilana symbolized the beginning of separation. The divine cycle was closing. The gods were returning to the stars, and mankind was left to govern itself, armed with memory, myth, and longing. The city of Bad Tibira, once the forge of the gods, became a sacred relic, its fires dimming, its temples silent. The priests kept the rituals alive, but the gods they invoked no longer appeared in the flesh. Still, the king list records no rebellion, no collapse. Instead, it reads as though the transfer of power was peaceful, a passing of the torch from divine kings to the next generation of rulers who were almost human. Then Dumuzi, the shepherd, became king. He ruled for 36,000 years. With Dumuzi, something profoundly human enters the story. He is not described as a radiant celestial being, but as the shepherd, a man of the fields, a symbol of earthly life, chosen by the gods to watch over the people. This marks the true turning point, the moment when kingship, once divine in essence, became a partnership between heaven and earth. But before we move into his reign, we must understand what Enmangilana's era really meant. It was the twilight of the gods, a slow sunset over the divine age. The heavens had not yet sealed themselves completely, but the doors were closing. The golden connection between worlds was slipping into myth. And in that fading light, humanity stood at the threshold, still illuminated by what had been, but already walking toward what would come, a world ruled by men who remembered the gods, but no longer walked beside them. Dumuzi, the shepherd, the king who died and was reborn. Then Dumuzi, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. 36,000 years. That's 10 sars, 10 complete cycles in Sumerian celestial time. But more remarkable than his duration was who he was. For the first time, the king list doesn't describe a ruler as a celestial lord, but as something closer to human, the shepherd. Dumuzi's story bridges heaven and earth. He was the first king remembered not just as a ruler, but as a being of emotion, sacrifice, and renewal. To the Sumerians, he represented a divine paradox, a god who could die and yet return again, a symbol of the endless rhythm between life and decay. His reign, according to the Weld Blundell prism, unfolded in the sacred city of Bad Kibera, the same city where divine metallurgy and celestial governance began. But unlike his predecessors, Dumuzi's domain was not the forge or the temple, it was the heart. The myths say he ruled during a time of balance, when heaven and earth were in perfect alignment. Harvests flourished, rivers flowed gently, and peace prevailed between gods and men. It was the last true age of harmony, but Dumuzi's reign is most remembered not for his governance, but for his relationship with the goddess Inanna, queen of heaven and earth. Inanna and Dumuzi were opposites made whole. She was the celestial power of love, war, and fertility. He was the humble shepherd king, grounded, nurturing, mortal. Their union symbolized the sacred marriage between sky and soil, the eternal bond between heaven and earth. Yet, as with all divine unions, balance eventually gave way to tragedy. In the ancient poem Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, the goddess ventures into the realm of death, leaving Dumuzi behind to rule in her absence. But when she returns, something in her has changed. She is reborn, more powerful, but colder. In the myth, the underworld demands a replacement. Someone must take her place below. And when Inanna looks upon her kingdom, she finds Dumuzi sitting on her throne, radiant in splendor, dressed in royal robes. The text says she fixed her eyes upon him, and the gaze of death fell. The demons seized Dumuzi and dragged him to the underworld. It was not a punishment of cruelty, it was cosmic balance. Life must yield to death for creation to continue. And so the shepherd king descended into darkness. But his story didn't end there. Each year, the Sumerians celebrated his return. They believed that Dumuzi's death marked the dry, lifeless summer, and his resurrection brought the rains and renewal of spring. Through his eternal cycle, they found meaning in the rhythms of nature, in loss and rebirth, in the dying and returning of the world itself. Dumuz. I became the first dying and rising god in recorded history. His story would echo through millennia, as Tammuz in Babylon, Osiris in Egypt, Adonis in Greece, and eventually Christ in early Christian tradition. The archetype was born here, in Sumer, in the tale of the shepherd king. But let's return to the king list. If we take the document literally, Dumuzi reigned for 36,000 years, a period so long that it seems beyond the human realm. And yet every line of his mythology reminds us that his essence was profoundly human. Could it be that his reign wasn't measured in literal years, but in cosmic cycles, epochs that marked the pulse of creation itself? Some scholars and theorists propose that these enormous reigns were not time spans in the earthly sense, but astronomical durations tied to the movement of stars and planets. If so, Dumuzi's 36,000-year reign could symbolize a complete precessional cycle, the time it takes the Earth's axis to wobble once through all constellations. In other words, the reign of the Shepherd King might have represented an entire age of human consciousness. But Dumuzi's influence didn't end with his death or his mythology. He became the spiritual core of Sumerian identity. His temples were filled with hymns of longing and renewal. Priestesses wept for him each year in rituals of mourning, reenacting his descent and return. Even kings who ruled centuries later traced their legitimacy back to him, claiming they, too, carried the shepherd's divine spark. One hymn reads, "Dumuzi, my lord, you are the light of dawn. You rise and the land awakens. You set and the rivers mourn." The language is unmistakable. This was no mere mortal ruler. He had become the living embodiment of the earth's pulse and the heaven's rhythm. And yet, there is another layer to Dumuzi's story, a more controversial one. Ancient astronaut theorists, like Zechariah Sitchin, suggested that Dumuzi might not have been simply symbolic. In Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian texts, Dumuzi was one of the younger Anunnaki, a hybrid of divine and human lineage, entrusted to govern humanity during the final age before the flood. According to this theory, his so-called death and resurrection may have been a metaphor for exile and return, or even for interplanetary travel, a being removed from Earth, only to descend again when the time was right. While mainstream scholars reject such interpretations, the parallels between Dumuzi's myth and similar global traditions continue to stir debate. Why does nearly every ancient culture tell of a divine being who dies, descends, and returns? Why does that story always mark the end of an age and the beginning of a new one? Dumuzi's reign marks the emotional climax of the Sumerian king list. For the first time, kingship was not about dominion, but about sacrifice. It was no longer about ruling forever, but about giving life back to the earth. And that might be the greatest legacy any king, human or divine, could leave behind. Then the kingship passed to Larak, and Sipid-Zidana became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. The gods had walked the earth, the shepherd had died and risen. And now the light began to fade once again. The final kings of the antediluvian world were waiting for the storm that would wash it all away. In Sipid-Zidana of Larak, the lost city of the gods, then the kingship passed to Larak, and Sipid-Zidana became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. 28,800 years. That number again, 8 Sars, the sacred cycle of the gods. But unlike the kings before him, Sipid-Zidana left almost nothing behind. No hymns, no myths, no great monuments, only a name and the ghost of a city. Larak, a city said to have existed before the Great Flood, a city so holy that even the Sumerians rarely spoke its name aloud. Its location has never been found, not in ruins, not in records, not even in the endless sands of Mesopotamia. It simply disappeared. But according to the Sumerian king list, Larak was one of the 5 original cities established by the gods themselves before the flood. Eridu, Bed, Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city represented an aspect of divine civilization. Eridu, the city of creation. Bed, Tibira, the forge of order. Sippar, the city of light. Shuruppak, the cradle of humanity. And Larak, the city of judgment. In Sipid-Zidana's reign over Larak, was described as an era of introspection and silence, a time when divine presence on earth was fading into the heavens. He ruled not as a conqueror, but as a custodian. Where others built and forged, Ensipa-Zidana guarded and waited. Some ancient texts, fragmented and nearly unreadable, refer to Larak as the city of divine healing and the hall of truth. If true, it might have been the spiritual counterpart to the material power of Eridu and Bad Tibera, a place not of stone or metal, but of spirit. Modern scholars often call Ensipa-Zidana a mystery, but to esoteric interpreters, he represents a phase in human evolution, the stillness before transformation, the pause between ages. In symbolic terms, he was the final echo of pure divine kingship before the flood of human consciousness washed it away. But there's more. Some researchers, particularly in alternative archaeology, propose that Larak wasn't just lost, it was hidden. They suggest that it could have been an energy hub, a spiritual node within a planetary grid established by the Anunnaki. In this view, the antediluvian cities weren't random settlements. They were stations aligned to harness cosmic forces. If Eridu was the foundation stone, and Bad Tibera the engine of creation, then Larak may have been the heart, the stabilizer of divine frequency. Ensipa-Zidana, its ruler, would then be not a king, but a guardian of a technology far beyond modern understanding. And here's where things get even stranger. According to the Sumerian king list, Ensipa-Zidana ruled for the same duration as Alulim, minus 28,800 years. The symmetry is striking. Could this have been deliberate? A way of showing that the cycle had come full circle, that the end was returning to its beginning? If Alulim represented the dawn of kingship, when divine power descended from heaven, then Ensipa-Zidana may represent the dusk, when that same power began to ascend back to the heavens. In that sense, his rule wasn't about what he did, but what was being undone. The heavens were closing their gates. The age of gods walking among men was ending, but not without warning. Ancient Mesopotamian texts suggest that during the final centuries of his reign, omens filled the sky. Stars flickered and vanished. The rivers turned strange colors. Priests recorded trembling in the earth, and a roar from the heavens that echoed across the plains. Perhaps these were natural events. Perhaps they were metaphors. But to the Sumerians, they were signs that something colossal was coming. The gods were preparing for departure, and the world was preparing for judgment. It's here that some theologians and mythographers link Ensipa-Zidana's story to the idea of the Watchers, the divine beings who looked upon humanity and intervened, sometimes disastrously. Perhaps Larak was not a city of humans at all, but a base for those Watchers, the Anunnaki, who remained behind to observe the final phase of divine rule on earth. Then, silence. The king list gives no more detail. After nearly 30,000 years, Ensipa-Zidana's reign ends abruptly. No war, no rebellion, no fall, only the words. Then the kingship passed to Sipper. And just like that, Larak and everything it represented vanished into myth. To this day, archaeologists have never found its remains. Some say it lies buried beneath the shifting sands of Iraq. Others whisper it may never have been of this world to begin with. Maybe Larak was not destroyed, maybe it ascended. Ensipa-Zidana's reign marks the beginning of the end. The divine kings are withdrawing, the flood is approaching, and the story of Earth's first civilization is reaching its final trembling note. Then the kingship passed to Sipper, and Enmendarana became king. He ruled for 21,000 years, and with Enmendarana, something remarkable happens once more. A mortal is lifted back into heaven. A king so pure, so wise, that the gods take him up to walk among them. He becomes the bridge between worlds, the ancient prototype of Enoch himself. Enmendarana of Sipper, the king who ascended without dying. Then the kingship passed to Sipper. Enmendarana became king. He ruled for 21,000 years. Sipper, the city of the sun. Built on the banks of the Euphrates, it was known as the home of Enkidu, the sun god who saw all things. If Eridu was the foundation of creation, Sipper was its illumination, a city where divine light touched mortal ground. It was here that Enmendarana ruled, the seventh king of the antediluvian world. 7, a sacred number in every ancient tradition. 7 heavens, 7 gates, 7 ages of man. And just as Enoch was the 7th from Adam, Enmendarana was the 7th from Alulim. Coincidence? The book of Enoch says no. Both were righteous. Both walked with the gods. Both were taken into heaven, not through death, but through divine ascension. In Sumerian tradition, Enmendarana was the beloved of Utu, the god of the sun and justice. The texts say he was chosen to receive the tablets of the gods, heavenly wisdom, and the secrets of time. He was taught the mysteries of divination, how to read the signs of the sky, and how to measure the flow of the heavens. The book of Enoch tells a strikingly similar story. Enoch, too, was taken up by divine beings, shown the workings of the universe, the motion of the sun and moon, the paths of the stars, the courses of the winds, and the balance of the elements. He too received a record, a book of wisdom, and was told to deliver it to humankind. The parallels are undeniable. Both men bridge heaven and earth. Both receive cosmic revelation. Both are immortalized as intermediaries between gods and men. But while Enoch's story comes wrapped in moral symbolism, Enmendarana's version feels technological, procedural. It doesn't describe divine rapture. It describes initiation. The text implies that he was instructed in how to interpret the heavenly tablets, as if the divine order was a system, a machine of light and mathematics. In the book of Enoch, we find almost the same language. The angels teach Enoch the secrets of the lightning and the thunder, the mysteries of the luminaries, and the courses of the stars. Both men become, in essence, the first astronomers of Earth. Sipper, under Enmendarana, was said to shine brighter than any city before it. Its ziggurats reflected the fire of the sun. Priests there carried out rituals of light, recording solar patterns and eclipses, marking time according to heavenly movements. In the mythic imagination of Sumer, Sipper was a miniature reflection of heaven, a city built as a mirror of the cosmos. And perhaps that was the point. If Laroch was the heart, then Sipper was the eye, the divine observatory, watching the final countdown to the flood. As centuries passed, the people of Sipper began to sense the end approaching. The flood myth was already taking shape. The world, corrupted by the mingling of gods and mortals, was sliding into chaos. And Enmendarana, like Enoch, was called. Upward before the cleansing came, some cuneiform texts hint that he was lifted by you two to the assembly of the gods. Others say his rule was ended by light, but in every version, he doesn't die. He ascends. From that point on, Sippar becomes a threshold, the place where heaven met earth for the last time before the flood erased the old world. And what happens next is cosmic symmetry. Because the king list records that after Anandrana's ascension, only one more king would rule. Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah. This is where history and myth collide. The kingship that once descended from heaven was about to be reclaimed. The gods would soon withdraw entirely, leaving behind their final warning: a single human family chosen to survive the flood. In that sense, and Manjarana's ascension marks not just an ending, but a transfer. He takes the divine wisdom back to heaven, while humanity prepares for rebirth. It is the closing of the celestial gate and the sealing of the first covenant. The Book of Enoch describes a similar arc. When Enoch ascends, the watchers are condemned, the Nephilim are destroyed, and the flood is announced. It's the same cosmic cycle: knowledge, corruption, judgment, renewal. The same pattern mirrored in Sumer, in Enoch, in every civilization's mythic memory. And Mandarana stands as the mirror of Enoch, a king turned prophet, a human turned celestial, the last messenger before the waters came. And after his ascension, the king list grows quiet. Only one line remains before the deluge. Then the kingship passed to Shuruppak. Ubaratutu became king. He ruled for 18,600 years. Then the flood swept over. The divine age had ended. The cities of the gods sank beneath the waves, and humanity, washed clean, would awaken in a new world, a world where kingship would rise again, not from heaven this time, but from the memory of what heaven once was, the age of the Anunnaki. Kings had lasted for 241,200 years. 8 rulers, 5 sacred cities, one forgotten world. And at its center, a pattern so precise, so deliberate, that it seems less like myth and more like the echo of something real: the flood and the return of kingship, the end of the Anunnaki age. Then the kingship passed to Shuruppak. Ubaratutu became king. He ruled for 18,600 years. Then the flood swept over. Shuruppak, the last of the 5 pre-flood cities. Its name means the healing place, but in this story it becomes the final refuge before the end. Here the last divine king ruled, Ubaratutu, the father of Ziusudra, the man who would become the Sumerian Noah, and through him, the ancient world would face its reckoning. According to the Sumerian flood myth recorded on broken tablets from Nippur and Ashur, the gods had grown weary of humankind. The noise, the corruption, the chaos born from forbidden unions between gods and mortals, all had filled the earth with violence. In heaven, the Anunnaki assembled. The decision was made. Humanity would be erased. The earth would be cleansed. It's here that the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian king list align perfectly. Both speak of divine rebellion. Both speak of forbidden knowledge. Both end in the same way: a flood set to reset creation. In Enoch's account, God commands Uriel to warn Noah, "Hide yourself, for the earth will be destroyed. The waters of the flood shall come upon the earth, and all things that are on it shall perish." In the Sumerian version, the god Enki secretly warns Ziusudra, the son of Ubaratutu, build a great ship, bring the seed of all living things inside. A flood is coming to destroy mankind. 2 names, 2 traditions, 1 story. Whether you call him Noah, Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra, the message is the same. A human being, chosen by the gods, is told to preserve life through the coming deluge. And once again, we see the pattern: divine knowledge, human corruption, judgment, and rebirth. When the rains began to fall, the world that had once glowed with divine presence was erased. Eridu, Bad Kibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, the 5 cities of the gods, were swallowed by the waters. The texts say the storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights. The earth trembled. The mountains vanished beneath the waves. Even the Watchers, the fallen beings who had defied the heavens, were bound and cast into the deep. The Book of Enoch describes it vividly. The earth labored and trembled. The fountains of the great deep were broken up. The windows of heaven were opened, and all flesh perished. In both traditions, this wasn't just a flood of water, it was a flood of memory, a reset of consciousness. The old world, ruled by gods and giants, was gone. When the waters receded, only one family remained: Ziusudra in Sumer, Noah in the Hebrew text. Each stands on the threshold of a new age. In the Sumerian version, Ziusudra offers sacrifice to the gods. He burns incense of cedar and myrtle, and the gods, moved by the scent, regret what they've done. Enlil, the storm god who unleashed the flood, relents. Enki speaks on behalf of humanity. The flood was over, and kingship would be restored, but this time it would not come from heaven. It would rise from the survivors themselves. After the flood had swept over, when kingship again descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. And just like that, the story begins again. A new line of kings, a new world. But something essential has changed. Before the flood, the rulers were divine, immortal beings whose lifespan stretched for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the kings became mortal. Their reigns shortened dramatically, from thousands of years to hundreds. From hundreds to mere decades, the divine spark had receded, leaving behind echoes, symbols, rituals, and myths that would shape human civilization forever. What the Book of Enoch calls the Watchers, the Sumerian texts call the Anunnaki, and what Enoch calls the sons of God. Sumer calls the kings who ruled from heaven. Different names, same archetype, beings who came down, taught forbidden knowledge, and were judged for it. Their legacy remained, woven into the memory of every civilization that followed, from Egypt to Babylon, from the Hebrew prophets to Greek mythology. The echoes of Enoch and Enmendarana, of Ubaratutu and Noah, of divine descent and human redemption. When we read the Book of Enoch and the Sumerian king list side by side, a pattern emerges. A cycle older than history itself. It begins with divine instruction, descends into human corruption, culminates in judgment, and ends with renewal. Then, inevitably, it begins again. Maybe that's why both texts survived. Because they aren't just stories of the past, they're warnings. Reminders of what happens when creation forgets its source. When the flood waters dried, the earth was quiet. The gods were gone. but their memory lingered in the stones, the stars, and the stories humanity would tell for thousands of years. The book of Enoch ends with a vision, a prophecy of the final judgment, when the watchers would face their punishment and the righteous would shine forever. The Sumerian king list ends with rebirth, kingship restored, civilization renewed. Both end with hope. Perhaps that's the lesson buried beneath the myth, that no matter how dark the age, how deep the flood, the spark of divine order always returns, because in every rise and fall of civilization, there's a whisper from the ancient past. We have been here before. And maybe, just maybe, the kings of old still watch from afar, waiting for the day when heaven and earth will meet again. These were the kings before the flood. 8 rulers, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. The Sumerian king list, the book of Enoch, and the king list speak the same truth in different tongues, that history is not linear. It is cyclical, a spiral of ascent and descent, of light and shadow, of heaven touching earth and retreating again.